The stagecoach rolled into Caldwell, Kansas on a Tuesday in the late spring of 1882, kicking up a cloud of pale dust that settled over the main street like a soft ghost. And when the door swung open and Margaret Bishop stepped down onto the sun-baked earth, she carried two things nobody in that town knew about: a letter she had written herself, and a heart so full of genuine longing that it nearly ached right through her ribs. She stood for a moment on the boardwalk, pressing her gloved hand against the side of her traveling trunk and squinting into the afternoon light. Caldwell was a cattle town, loud and raw at its edges, smelling of horse and leather and the faint iron tang of the nearby stockyards. Men moved along the street with purpose, boots striking the wood of the elevated walkways in confident rhythms. A pair of ranch hands leaned against the post of the general store and watched her with open curiosity, the way men in such places always watched a woman arriving alone. Margaret was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest gray bonnet, and eyes the color of strong tea, warm and searching. She wore a traveling dress of blue wool, slightly faded at the elbows from a journey that had begun 14 days earlier in St. Louis, Missouri, where she had packed everything she owned into one trunk and one carpet bag, and walked away from a life that had offered her nothing but diminishing options and the slow suffocation of a boarding house she could barely afford. She had seen the advertisement in the St. Louis Dispatch 2 months prior. A rancher in Caldwell, Kansas, seeking a capable woman of good character to come west as a housekeeper and potential companion. The letter of introduction required was to come from a minister or a man of standing who could vouch for the applicant's moral fiber and domestic competence. The trouble was that Margaret Bishop had no minister who knew her well enough, and no man of standing who could be bothered to write on her behalf. She had been raised in an orphanage on the eastern edge of Missouri, had spent her adult years working in a laundry and later as a seamstress, and had no family connections to speak of. She was capable and strong and honest in every way that mattered to her, but the world often required paper proof of a person's worth, and paper proof was the one thing she lacked. So she had written the letter herself. She had copied the style from letters she had read in the offices of the laundry, had used her best penmanship, had signed it with the name of a Reverend Thomas Aldcott of the First Methodist Church of St. Louis, a man she had heard mentioned in passing, and who, she believed with some accuracy, had relocated to the territories and would be difficult to reach for verification. She had felt the wrongness of it even as she pressed the wax seal. She had told herself it was not the letter that defined her. She had told herself that if she were given half a chance, she would prove her worth not through borrowed words but through her own honest labor. She had told herself all of that, and she had come west anyway, because staying behind had stopped being a choice she could make with any dignity. Now she stood on the boardwalk of Caldwell with that letter folded inside her carpet bag and asked a passing boy with a mule where she might find the Shelby ranch. The boy looked up at her with wide brown eyes. "That would be Isaiah Shelby's place, ma'am, about 4 miles out the south road. You got business with Mr. Shelby?" "I believe I do," Margaret said. She hired a wagon driver for 25 cents to take her out the south road, and she sat in the back of his flatbed with her trunk and her bag and watched the town of Caldwell dissolve behind her, replaced by open prairie stretching in every direction like a great amber sea, the grass moving in long, slow waves under the Kansas wind. The sky above was enormous and blue and completely without apology, the kind of sky that made a person feel both very small and oddly free. The Shelby Ranch appeared after about 20 minutes of travel down a rutted dirt road. It was not the grand estate Margaret had half feared and half hoped for. It was a working ranch in the most honest sense of the word, a solid 2-story farmhouse built from pine and whitewash, a large barn that had seen better decades but stood with confidence, 3 outbuildings of various purposes, and a series of corrals where cattle moved in slow, bovine patience. A windmill turned lazily against the sky. A vegetable garden ran along the south side of the house, and it was badly in need of attention, the weeds having made considerable progress in whatever recent absence of care had occurred there. The wagon driver set her trunk down near the front porch and departed without ceremony. Margaret stood alone before the house, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her bonnet, and then she walked up the 2 porch steps and knocked. She heard boots on a wooden floor, unhurried but definite, and then the door opened, and she saw Isaiah Shelby for the first time. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet and a bit more, with the kind of lean, weathered build that came from years of outdoor labor rather than any deliberate effort. His hair was dark brown, thick and slightly overgrown at the collar, and he had a jaw that was set with what might have been habitual concentration or simple reserve. She could not yet tell which. His eyes were the color of sage at twilight, a gray-green that shifted with the light and held something careful and attentive in their depths. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe 31, dressed in a plain work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, his forearms carrying the tan of someone who spent his days outdoors. He held a coffee mug in one hand and looked at her with an expression of genuine and open surprise. "Good afternoon," Margaret said, and was proud of how steady her voice came out. "My name is Margaret Bishop. I wrote to you some weeks ago in response to your advertisement." He stared at her for a moment longer than was entirely polite, but not with the cold assessment she had feared. It was more the look of a man who had been expecting something abstract and was now confronted with something real. "Miss Bishop," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, shaped by the wide open country around him. "You're earlier than I expected. I thought you'd send word before arriving." "I sent a letter from St. Louis confirming I would come," she said. "I hope it arrived." He opened the door wider and stepped back. It did. Come in out of the sun. The inside of the house told her a great deal in a single sweep of her eyes. It was not dirty exactly, but it was a home that had been managed by a man living alone for some time. The surfaces were clear but dusty. The kitchen showed evidence of simple cooking done efficiently, but without pleasure. A pair of boots stood beside the back door in a way that suggested no one had recently reminded the owner to put them away. Above the fireplace hung a framed piece of needlework, faded but carefully preserved, that read "Home is where the heart rests," and the sight of it made something tighten briefly in Margaret's chest. Isaiah set his mug on the kitchen table and pulled out a chair for her in a gesture that was polite without being performative. She sat. He sat across from her and looked at her directly, and she noticed that he did not look away when she met his eyes, which she found she appreciated more than she had expected to. "You came a long way," he said. "I did. Alone." "Yes." He considered this. "My advertisement asked for a letter of introduction, from a minister or a man of standing." Margaret's heart rate increased, but she kept her hands flat and still on the table. "I sent one with my application." He rose and went to a desk near the window, opened a drawer, and returned with her letter. He laid it on the table between them and smoothed it once with his hand. "Reverend Thomas Aldcott of the First Methodist Church of St. Louis," he read, and then looked up at her. "I made some inquiries when I was in town last month. The postmaster knows a fair amount about the churches in St. Louis, having family there. He told me Reverend Aldcott left St. Louis for the Oregon Territory in 1879. That's 3 years before this letter was written." The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a cow lowed in the distance. Margaret looked at the letter on the table between them, and then she looked at Isaiah Shelby, and she made a decision in that moment that was perhaps the most genuinely courageous thing she had done in her entire life. "It is a forgery," she said, clearly and without drama. "I wrote it myself." He did not flinch. He did not stand. He looked at her with those sage-colored eyes and said nothing for a moment that felt very long. "Why?" he asked finally. "Because I had no one who could write it for me," she said. "I was raised in an orphanage. I have worked in a laundry and as a seamstress for the last 6 years. I have no minister who knows me and no man of standing who might spare the time. I have only myself to recommend me, and I knew that was not enough for your advertisement, But I also knew that if I could only come and show you what I am capable of, the letter would not matter. She paused and then added more quietly, I am sorry I deceived you. It was wrong of me and I knew it when I did it, but I am not sorry I came. Isaiah Shelby sat across the table from her and looked at her for a long and measured moment. The afternoon light came through the window and lay across the table between them like a calm river. He picked up the letter and he folded it once, and he set it aside. The letter does not matter, he said. 3 words that dropped into the air of that kitchen like 3 stones into still water, each one creating a ripple that spread outward and did not stop. What does matter? Margaret asked, because she needed to understand the terms. Whether you are who you say you are, he said. Whether you can do the work and whether you mean to stay. I've had women come out here who lasted 2 weeks before the wind and the distance sent them back east. I'm not interested in temporary arrangements. I have nothing to go back to, Margaret said simply. This is not an escape from something better. There is nothing better waiting for me in St. Louis. I came here because I wanted to build something, and I could not build it there. He looked at her steadily and then nodded once, a small definitive motion. Then we'll see how it goes, he said. What followed were 3 weeks that Margaret would later describe, when pressed to name the best period of her life, as the weeks when she learned that loneliness has a sound, and the sound is a ranch house coming alive again. She took over the kitchen on the first day and discovered that Isaiah Shelby subsisted primarily on beans, cornbread, and black coffee, which explained a certain gauntness about him that she had noticed but not remarked upon. She made a proper breakfast that first morning, eggs and salt pork and biscuits that came out golden and light, and when she set the plate before him, he sat and looked at it for a moment before picking up his fork. You can cook, he said, which was as close to high praise as she would learn was common for him. I can do a great many things, she said pleasantly, and went to assess the state of the vegetable garden. The garden she attacked with considerable determination over the course of the first week, pulling weeds by the fistful each morning before the heat came up, turning the soil around the bean plants and the tomato vines, reinforcing the stakes that had leaned and collapsed over what she gathered had been a substantial period of neglect. On the third day, working with her sleeves rolled and her bonnet set aside in favor of direct practicality, she looked up to find Isaiah standing at the garden's edge with 2 mugs of coffee, watching her with an expression she could not quite name. She stood and accepted the coffee, and they stood together in the morning air, the sky still pale above them, the ranch quiet and warm around them. When did you stop tending it? She asked, nodding at the garden. He looked out over the rows with a complicated kind of expression. About 18 months ago, he said. My mother used to keep the garden. She passed in the autumn of 1880. I didn't have much inclination for it after that. Margaret looked at the garden and then at him. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it without embellishment or performance, the clean, simple fact of it. She would have liked your biscuits, he said, and turned back toward the barn. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a landscape by moving through it slowly. He was the second son of settlers who had come out from Tennessee when Isaiah was 12 years old, had watched his father build the ranch from nothing over the course of 20 years, and had inherited it when his father died of a fever 4 years prior. His mother had remained with him after that, managing the household with a quiet competence that he clearly missed profoundly, and when she too had gone, he had been left alone on the ranch with 3 hired hands and a silence that had apparently grown very large. His hired hands were Clem Purdy, a leathery man of 50 or so with a voice like a creek over stones, and the Navarro brothers, Tomas and Esteban, who had come up from the territories some years back and worked with a quiet skill that Isaiah clearly respected deeply. The 4 of them formed a functioning unit of labor, and they received Margaret with varying degrees of warmth. Clem was immediately and cheerfully approving. Tomas nodded at her with serious dignity. Esteban, the younger of the brothers at around 25, watched her with cautious curiosity for about a week before deciding, apparently, that she was trustworthy, at which point he began leaving wildflowers from the pasture on the kitchen windowsill every morning, a gesture so purely generous that it made her eyes sting. The community of Caldwell was not entirely indifferent to Margaret's arrival. Women from the surrounding farms and ranches had their opinions about a young woman arriving alone with a letter from a minister and taking up residence in the home of an unmarried man, and those opinions made their way back to the Shelby Ranch in the time-honored manner of small frontier communities. The most direct carrier of those opinions was a woman named Hetty Crawford, the wife of the neighboring rancher, who arrived on a Wednesday morning in Margaret's second week with a pie in one hand and a sharp assessment in her eyes. Hetty was perhaps 50 years old, built solidly, with gray-streaked hair and an expression that made it clear she had survived a great deal and would survive more. She sat at the kitchen table across from Margaret and accepted the coffee Margaret poured without comment, and then looked around the kitchen with the comprehensive evaluation of a woman who had kept her own house for 30 years. "You've cleaned," Hetty said. "It needed it," Margaret said. "Isaiah won't mind. He hasn't mentioned it." Hetty examined her for a long moment. "Where are you from originally?" "Missouri, an orphanage in the eastern part of the state." Something shifted in Hetty's expression, not quite softening but becoming less sharp at the edges. "That's a hard start," she said. "I managed," Margaret said. "I can see that." Hetty set down her coffee cup and folded her hands on the table. "I want to be plain with you, Miss Bishop, because I find it saves everyone time. The women in this community are watching to see whether you are what you appear to be, a capable, honest woman looking to build a life, or something less straightforward. Isaiah Shelby is a good man. He has been good to this community, and he has been decent to everyone on his land. He deserves to be dealt with honestly." Margaret met her eyes steadily. "I intend to be honest with him," she said. "I already have been about what I am and where I come from." Hetty studied her for another beat and then picked up her coffee again. "That's a reasonable answer," she said, and something in her posture eased, the way a gate eases open when the latch is lifted. "The pie is apple. I'll show you my crust recipe if you'd like." Isaiah used to eat half a pie standing at the counter when he was a boy, and his mother would send him out the back door to keep him from stealing the other half. Margaret laughed, genuinely, the first real laugh she had managed in what felt like a long time, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both a little. "I would very much like that recipe," she said. Hetty Crawford became, in the weeks that followed, the closest thing to a friend Margaret had in Caldwell, and the older woman's visible acceptance of her went a considerable way toward easing the community's collective assessment. Hetty introduced her at the dry goods store to Ruth Abernathy, the shopkeeper's wife, who was warm and practical, and to Clara Dunning, the schoolteacher, who was sharp-minded and interesting to talk to. Margaret, who had spent years at the margins of other people's social worlds without ever being properly welcomed into one, found this careful and genuine inclusion almost more than she knew how to receive at first. The days on the ranch had a rhythm that she discovered she loved. She rose before full light, lit the stove, made coffee, and began breakfast. She managed the house through the morning, the cooking and cleaning and mending and preserving that were the real physical labor of keeping a household functional. In the afternoons, she worked in the garden or helped Clem with whatever task he was engaged in, because she was not a woman who could sit idle, and the afternoon work was often where the most interesting conversations happened. Clem Purdy, she discovered, had been born in Virginia, had fought in the war between the states on the Union side despite being Southern-born, and had come west afterward because going home had not felt possible. He talked about the war with a matter-of-fact sorrow that was somehow more affecting than dramatic grief would have been, and Margaret listened without trying to fix or redirect him, which seemed to be what he needed. "Most people either want me to be sorry about it or proud of it," he told her one afternoon while they were mending fence on the eastern pasture. "Can't just let a man be complicated about a thing." "You can be complicated about anything you like with me," she said. I have found that most true things are complicated." He looked at her sideways and grinned, a deeply creased expression that rearranged his whole face. "You're all right, Miss Bishop," he said, "for an Easterner." "High praise," she said, and he laughed. Isaiah she observed more carefully than she let on, the way she imagined a naturalist might observe a creature that was both interesting and somewhat wary. He worked from before dawn until after dark most days, the labor of the ranch requiring a kind of physical commitment that left little room for anything else. He was not a man who talked easily, but he was not cold. He simply seemed to have learned, living alone, that silence was a neutral thing rather than an emptiness that required filling. He ate her meals with appreciative attention and thanked her each time with a directness that she appreciated. He asked her questions occasionally, not the probing kind but genuine ones, about how she had learned to cook, about the orphanage, about the work she had done in St. Louis. He listened to her answers with his full attention, the way some people listen who are not always in a hurry to respond. On a Thursday evening in her third week, when a thunderstorm came rolling in from the northwest with the dramatic authority of a Kansas spring storm, Margaret was standing on the porch watching the approach of it when Isaiah came to stand beside her. They stood together as the lightning fractured the sky far out over the prairie, the thunder following like a slow and tremendous response, the wind beginning to carry the electric smell of rain. "It's something," she said. "It is," he agreed. They stood side by side for a while without speaking, watching the storm come in the way it came across open prairie, with nothing to diminish it, enormous and uncontained. The rain arrived like a curtain being drawn across the world, and they stayed on the porch beneath its overhang even as it fell hard and straight around them, the garden and the corrals disappearing into gray. "Can I ask you something?" Isaiah said. "Of course. When you forged the letter, did you worry you'd be found out?" She considered being evasive and decided against it. "Yes," she said. "Every day since I wrote it. I worried about it on the stagecoach the entire way here. I had an argument with myself about it for most of Missouri. But you came anyway. I came anyway." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the rain. "What was the argument?" She turned her head to look at him. He was looking out at the rain, his profile steady and thoughtful against the gray light. "The argument was between the person I have always been told I need to be in order to be acceptable and the person I actually am," she said. "The acceptable version of me would have stayed in St. Louis and found another boarding house and kept her head down and waited for something to change. The actual version of me got on the stagecoach." He turned and looked at her then, and the look was quiet and full and very direct. "I'm glad the actual version got on the stagecoach," he said. The rain fell around them in the April dark, and Margaret felt something shift in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite happiness, but was something very close to both, something warm and cautious and beginning. She thought about it later, lying in the small upstairs room that had become hers, listening to the storm move east. She thought about the way his voice had sounded saying that. She thought about the fact that she was not a foolish woman, and she had always been very clear-eyed about her own emotions, and that she had recognized from approximately the fourth day on the ranch that Isaiah Shelby was exactly the kind of man she had stopped allowing herself to imagine she might meet, because imagining things that seemed impossible had always struck her as a form of cruelty to oneself. She thought about all of this very clearly and honestly, and then told herself to go to sleep. The event that broke something open between them, that cracked the careful professional arrangement like a shell to reveal what was living inside it, happened on a Friday morning in her 5th week. Margaret had gone into Caldwell in the ranch wagon with Esteban to collect supplies. They had gone first to the general store, then to the feed merchant, and were making the final stop at the post office when a man she did not recognize stepped off the boardwalk and addressed her with a familiarity that was immediately alarming. He was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in the style of a man who had money or wanted people to think he did, with a coat that was too fine for the dust of a frontier town, and a hat tilted at an angle that suggested deliberate performance. His name, as he introduced himself without any invitation, was Gerald Crane, and he had the eyes of a man who was always calculating something. "Miss Bishop, isn't it?" he said. "I heard you came out from St. Louis. I have some connections in St. Louis myself." Margaret's stomach pulled tight. "Good morning," she said neutrally. "I knew a fellow at the Methodist church there," Crane said conversationally, with the specific casualness of a man watching for a reaction. "Reverend Aldcott, good man. I was surprised to hear he'd written a letter for you, given that he's been in Oregon these past 3 years." The street was busy enough that several people nearby could hear this exchange if they chose to pay attention. Esteban had gone still beside her in the particular way of a man who has identified a potential threat and is waiting to understand its nature. "I'm not sure what you're suggesting," Margaret said, though she was entirely sure. "I'm suggesting that your letter of introduction is not what it appears to be," Crane said, still conversational, still easy, which made it worse. "And I'm suggesting that a man like Isaiah Shelby, who is well regarded in this community and who sits on the board of the Cattlemen's Association, might be very interested to know the character of the woman he's hired." He paused and tilted his head slightly. "Or, alternatively, this could be a conversation just between us." This was the part where the threat clarified itself. Margaret looked at Gerald Crane with clear and steady eyes and said, "Are you attempting to extort me?" He blinked, apparently having expected a different reaction, something more like panic or compliance. "I would call it a business arrangement," he said. "I would call it what it is," she said. "And I would also tell you that you are approximately 3 days too late because Isaiah Shelby already knows about the letter, and he already knows it from me because I told him myself." Now Crane's easy expression changed. He had not expected that. "You told him?" "Within the first hour of my arrival," she said. "He made his judgment based on the full truth of the matter and employed me anyway. So whatever you imagine you have over me, Mr. Crane, you do not have it. Good day." She walked past him with Esteban at her side, and she was very calm until they reached the wagon, at which point she gripped the side rail and took 3 slow breaths. "That man is trouble," Esteban said quietly. "Yes," she agreed. "You handled it very well. Thank you." She released the rail and climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Do you know who he is?" "He has been trying to buy land in this county for the past year," Esteban said, climbing up beside her and gathering the reins. "He wants the range land. Several small ranchers have had difficulties when they refuse to sell. Equipment breaks in unexpected ways. Cattle go missing, not enough to prove anything." He glanced at her sideways. "He has been trying to find something against Isaiah for some time. Isaiah has the largest holding south of the river, and he will not sell." This information landed heavily. Margaret looked back at Caldwell's Main Street as the wagon pulled away and thought about Gerald Crane's calculating eyes and the specific way a man who uses people's vulnerabilities as leverage tends to keep using them until someone makes it impossible for him to do so. She told Isaiah about the encounter that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, while the last of the daylight went gold through the windows. She told him all of it, including the precise nature of Crane's implied threat, and she watched his expression move through several things in sequence: attention, recognition, and then something that was not quite anger but was related to it, a controlled and purposeful displeasure. "He's been at this for a while," Isaiah said. "He came to me with an offer for the South Range last autumn. I declined. The offer was not generous and the land is not for sale at any price." "Esteban told me about the incidents with the smaller ranchers," she said. Isaiah looked at her steadily. "You're not afraid of him." "I am afraid of him," she corrected. "I am not controlled by it." "Those are different things." He looked at her with an expression that was wholly unlike any he had shown her before. It was open and direct and carried something in it that was very warm. "Yes," he said quietly. "They are." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for a moment, just briefly, the touch of it warm and firm and then gone, and he pulled back and looked at the table and then at the window, and the tips of his ears were, she noticed with considerable internal interest, faintly red. "I'll speak to the sheriff tomorrow," he said. "Let him know Crane approached you. It won't stop him, but it begins a record." She nodded. "I think that's wise. And I want you to know," he said, still looking at the window, "that whatever Crane thinks he has or thinks he knows, it doesn't change anything here. The letter doesn't matter. Your being here is not contingent on that letter or on anyone's outside opinion of you. I want that to be clear." Margaret looked at his profile against the window light and thought about how strange and full the world was, that she had come so far and deceived her way to the door and been let inside on the basis of her own truth. "It's clear," she said softly. He turned and looked at her then, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the kitchen held them in its warm quiet like a pair of hands cupped around a small and important flame. Gerald Crane did not disappear from the landscape. Men like him rarely do. But Isaiah filed his account with Sheriff Tom Greer, a deliberate man in his mid-40s who had the measured disposition of someone who had seen enough of the frontier's chaos to put genuine value in the rule of law. The sheriff took down the account of Crane's approach to Margaret with careful interest and noted that 3 other residents of the county had similar accounts, none of which had been individually significant enough to act upon but which together formed a pattern of behavior that was now formally documented. "He's using people's secrets like currency," the sheriff said, when Isaiah and Margaret sat across from his desk. "That's extortion by any definition, even if no money changed hands. The fact that your household knew about the letter already, and Crane couldn't use it that way, is actually useful information." Margaret, sitting straight-backed in the sheriff's office, said, "He will find another approach. He is not the kind of man who accepts a closed door." The sheriff looked at her with a kind of professional respect. "No, he is not," he agreed. He was right. Crane's next approach came not at Margaret but at the ranch itself. One morning in late May, Clem found the fence along the southern pasture cut in 4 places, and 40 head of cattle had wandered through onto the open range during the night. It took 2 days to round them all up, 2 days of hard riding in which Isaiah and the Navarro brothers and Clem covered enormous distances across the Kansas grassland, and Margaret kept the coffee going and the food ready, and rode out herself on the second afternoon with provisions when Tomas came back to the house for water, and turned around and went back out again. Isaiah came home on the evening of the second day, caked in dust, and exhausted in the fundamental way of someone who has spent 48 hours in motion. Margaret had a meal ready and hot water for washing, and she set them both before him without fanfare and sat across from him while he ate and did not ask him questions he was too tired to answer. When he had eaten and the worst of the exhaustion had been taken down by food and warmth, he looked at her across the table and said, "I recovered all 40 head. I know, Clem told me. The fence was cut deliberately, 4 places clean cuts, not an accident." "No," she said. "I didn't think it was." He rubbed his hand across his face. "Crane cannot own this range if I'm on it, and I intend to remain on it." "Of course you do," she said simply. "This is your home." He looked at her with eyes that were tired but clear, and she saw in them something that had been building quietly for weeks, something that had been growing the way things grow in good soil, steadily and with intention. "Margaret," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name without the miss attached to it, and the difference was the distance between formal and intimate, small as a step, enormous as a crossing. "Yes," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask." He was quiet for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. Then he looked up at her. "Are you content here? Not whether the work is manageable or whether you find it tolerable. I mean whether you are genuinely, truly content in this place." She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought about the mornings when the light came up over the prairie, and the whole world turned gold, and the grass moved, and the air smelled of dew and earth. She thought about the garden, green and growing under her care. She thought about Clem's stories and Esteban's wildflowers and Hetty Crawford's pie crust recipe and the enormous Kansas sky. She thought about Isaiah Shelby at the kitchen table across from her, patient and direct and real. "Yes," she said, "genuinely, truly." He nodded slowly. "Good," he said. Because I have been trying to figure out how to tell you that the arrangement as it currently stands is not what I want it to be. Her heart moved in a way that she noted without allowing it to alter her expression. What do you want it to be? She asked carefully. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly, and the directness of it was the most honest thing she had felt in years. I want you to stay here not as an employee, he said. I want you to stay as something else. Something that would require a very different kind of conversation. You are being very careful with your words, she observed. The corner of his mouth curved slightly, the first real smile she had seen from him, small and true. I am aware of that. You could simply say what you mean. He looked at her, and the small smile became something more open, more unguarded. I have thought about you every day since you sat at this table and told me the truth about that letter, he said. I thought about you on 2 days of riding across half the range today, and I thought you would probably have an efficient opinion about the fence situation if I asked you. And I found that what I wanted most when I came home was to sit across from you and tell you we got them all back. Not Clem. Not the boys. You. He stopped. That is what I mean. The kitchen was very quiet and very warm. I have thought about you too, she said. Since approximately the 4th day, if I'm being precise about it. He laughed, which was something she had heard very little of before, and the sound of it was low and warm and filled the room with something that had not been there before. Is that so? He said. I'm a precise person, she said seriously. And then she was laughing too, and they sat across the kitchen table laughing together in the lamplight with the Kansas night outside the windows and the cattle settled in the corrals and the windmill turning in the dark, and something that had been knocking quietly at a door inside Margaret Bishop's chest for weeks walked through it entirely. There was a particular shape to the weeks that followed, a quality of becoming that Margaret would think about for the rest of her life. They were careful with each other in the way that people who have both been alone for a long time tend to be careful, not distant but deliberate, moving towards something with the consciousness of what it meant. There were long evenings on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed to belong to another world. There were conversations that began about practical things, about the fence repair or the state of the cattle market or the possibility of putting in a second garden bed, and became, by the slow and natural drift of two minds finding each other interesting, conversations about larger things. He told her about his father, who had been a demanding man, not unkind, but with expectations that had left little room for error. He told her that he had loved the ranch and been shaped by it, and that he sometimes wondered if he had let the shape of it crowd out other things. He told her this not in confession, but in the manner of a man who was thinking out loud to someone he trusted, and she understood what a gift that was. She told him things she had not told anyone. About the orphanage and the particular loneliness of a child who grows up among other lonely children, which is its own specific kind of isolation. About the laundry and the seamstress work, and the way she had measured her life in the small increments of weekly wages and the view from a boarding house window and the steady, grinding recognition that this was not enough, that she wanted more, that wanting more did not make her greedy but human. You were always going to leave, he said one evening, not as accusation but as understanding. Always, she agreed. I just needed a direction. He looked at the horizon, the last ribbon of orange fading above the dark line of the prairie. I am glad the direction was here, he said. She reached over without thinking and put her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the cooling evening, and it was so simple and so necessary that neither of them felt any need to remark on it. The matter of Gerald Crane resolved itself in early June in a way that none of them had entirely anticipated. It was Hetty Crawford's husband, Robert Crawford, a taciturn man of considerable local standing, who finally put the precise shape of events together. He had been collecting accounts from the smaller ranchers who had suffered Crane's attention, and he brought them all to the sheriff together with a written complaint, and the testimony of a land agent in Wichita who had been pressured by Crane into falsifying a property record. This last piece of evidence, the land agent having apparently reached his own limit with the arrangement, and decided that cooperation with the law was preferable to continued complicity, was the specific weight that broke the matter open. Gerald Crane was arrested on a Thursday in the first week of June. Sheriff Greer rode out to the Shelby ranch to tell Isaiah the news, and also to tell Margaret, which she found both unexpected and moving. You standing your ground in May, when he approached you in town, put the record in the right place at the right time, the sheriff told her. It's not a small thing. She thought about a young woman on a stagecoach from St. Louis with a forged letter in her bag and a stubborn refusal to be only what circumstance told her she could be. Good, she said. I'm glad it amounted to something. Isaiah, standing beside her on the ranch house porch as the sheriff's horse moved back up the south road, let out a long breath. That's done then, he said. It appears so, she said. He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light was on his face, and the relief in him was real and clean. I've been meaning to ask you something, he said. Something more specific than what I asked before. Her heart was very quiet and very large all at once. Have you? She said. I have. He turned to face her more fully, and his expression was open and serious and entirely without the careful distance he had maintained in the beginning. I'm not a man who does well with elaborate speeches. I believe you know that about me by now. I do, she said. It is not something I require. What I want is to ask you to marry me, he said. Not because it's the practical arrangement, or because it solves any particular problem. Because when I think about the future of this ranch and this place and this life, every version of that future that seems worth having has you in it. Because you are the most genuinely brave and genuinely honest person I've met in a very long time, and I admire that, and I am not willing to let it ride off down the South Road someday if I can do anything at all to prevent it. Margaret looked at Isaiah Shelby on the porch of the house that had become, over the course of these weeks, the first place since childhood that felt like somewhere she belonged, and she thought about forged letters and real hearts and the enormous distance a person will travel when they believe, somewhere deep in the bones of themselves, that something worth having is waiting. Yes, she said, without hesitation, yes. He reached out and took both her hands and held them, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just, very carefully, been allowed to set it down. They were married in Caldwell in the second week of July, 1882, in the Methodist Church, under a minister who had no reason at all to doubt Margaret Bishop's character, because everyone in the county who had formed an opinion of her by then had formed a favorable one. Hetty Crawford organized the reception with the determined efficiency of a woman who considers community celebration to be a moral responsibility. Ruth Abernathy baked a cake. Clara Dunning gave a short speech that was eloquent and made several people cry. Clem Purdy, dressed in the cleanest shirt Margaret had ever seen him wear, stood up straight and emotional during the ceremony in a way that he would have firmly denied if anyone mentioned it afterward. Tomas and Esteban wore their good clothes and watched with the warm and slightly ceremonious dignity with which they approached most important occasions. Margaret wore a dress that she had made herself over the course of 3 weeks in the evenings, cut from ivory cotton and trimmed with a narrow blue ribbon that matched the color of the dress she had arrived in, which felt right in a way she could not entirely explain. She carried a small bunch of wildflowers that Esteban had gathered that morning from the summer pasture. Isaiah stood at the front of the church in a black coat she had not seen before and looked at her when she walked up the aisle with an expression that was completely unguarded for the first time in all the weeks she had known him, open and full and unmistakably happy, the look of a man who has decided, entirely, to be where he is. She stood beside him and felt the warm and certain rightness of it, the way a key feels when it turns in the correct lock. They spoke their vows in clear and steady voices, both of them meaning every word with the complete conviction of people who had chosen each other fully and without reservation. After the ceremony, while the celebration was in full swing in the church hall with fiddle music and long tables of food, Isaiah found her standing at the open door looking out at the July sky, still enormous and blue above the Kansas prairie. He came to stand beside her, very close, his arm against hers. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am extremely all right," she said. "You went quiet. I was thinking." "About what?" She turned to look at him. "About 14 days on a stagecoach and a forged letter and a great deal of fear," she said, "and how entirely worth it all of that was." He took her hand. "Yes," he said. "I would do it all again," she said. "Every bit of it, the letter and the fear and all of it, I would do it again." "I hope you never have to," he said. "No," she agreed. "I believe I am arrived." He smiled, the full, unguarded smile that she was still learning to recognize as rare and therefore precious. "You are arrived," he said. "Welcome home, Margaret Shelby." The name settled over her like something she had been carrying the shape of all along without knowing it. "Thank you," she said. "It took me a while." "It took exactly the right amount of time," he said. And then Hetty Crawford was at the door calling them back in because the fiddler had started a reel, and there was a general expectation that the bride and groom would dance, and Margaret laughed and let Isaiah pull her back into the warmth and noise and color of the celebration. She had never danced in a church hall before. She had never had anyone to dance with. She discovered that Isaiah Shelby was not a natural dancer, but was an earnest one, which she found entirely more endearing than technical grace would have been. And when he stepped on her foot once and looked mortified, she laughed so hard that half the room laughed with her. And the evening became exactly the kind of evening that a person carries inside them for the rest of their life. The summer on the ranch after they were married had a different quality than the weeks before, not radically changed in its practical texture, but deepened in some essential way. The way a well-played piece of music sounds when the full chord is finally resolved. They worked alongside each other through the long Kansas summer days, the ranch finding a new kind of order and warmth under the combined energy of two people who had both been waiting for this kind of life without being entirely certain it was available to them. Margaret expanded the vegetable garden into a second bed in late July, putting in fall crops with the systematic ambition of someone planning a future. Isaiah watched her work one afternoon from the fence line with an expression she had come to recognize as his version of contentment, quiet and steady and warm. "You're planning for winter," he said. "I am planning for every season," she said, and looked up at him with a directness that made him smile. The cattle market that autumn was favorable, the best in several years, and Isaiah came home from the stockyards in Caldwell with a light in his face that she had not seen before, and that made him look briefly younger, the version of him that would have existed before the losses of his father and then his mother, before the long years of managing the ranch alone. "It was a good year," he said, setting his hat on the peg inside the door. "Then we should plan for a good next year," she said. "You're already planning." "I am always planning." He crossed the kitchen and stopped close enough that she had to tilt her face up to look at him properly. "I love that about you," he said simply, and the directness of it, so characteristic of him, still had the power to move her completely. "I love you," she said, because it was true and because she had learned from a life of insufficient warmth not to leave true and important things unsaid. "I love you," he said, equally simple, equally complete. In the autumn of 1882, Margaret Shelby began teaching reading and writing to a group of 6 children from the neighboring farms and ranches on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, because Clara Dunning had more students than the schoolhouse could hold, and because Margaret had observed that 3 of the Navarro brothers' younger cousins, newly arrived from the territories, were not enrolled anywhere and had no access to schooling. She set up a table in the ranch house parlor, cleared it of the accumulated paperwork that had colonized it under Isaiah's management, and taught with the focused practicality she brought to everything. Isaiah, coming in one afternoon to find his parlor occupied by 6 children in various stages of learning to form letters, stood in the doorway for a moment with an expression that was profoundly, quietly moved. That evening he said, "You don't have to do this." "I know," she said. "I want to. There are children here who need it and I am capable of providing it. Those two facts require a response." He looked at her across the dinner table with the look she privately thought of as his seeing her look, the one that was direct and full and entirely without the reserve he wore in public. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she corrected. "Both," he said firmly. The winter came hard that year, as Kansas winters did, the first snow arriving in December with a conviction that suggested it intended to stay for a while. The ranch settled into the different pace of the cold months, the cattle moved closer in, the days shortened dramatically, and the evenings stretched long and warm around the fire. Margaret discovered that Isaiah had a habit of reading in the evenings that she had not known about because the summer evenings had been too busy with outside work. He had a modest but carefully selected collection of books on a shelf beside the fireplace, and she worked her way through them with pleasure while he sat across from her with his own book, the two of them quiet and companionable in the lamplight, the fire talking between them. "I did not know you were such a reader," she said one evening. "You did not ask," he said without looking up, and there was a gentle humor in it. "I'm asking now." He looked up from his page. "My mother read to us when we were small. I got the habit from her." He paused. "She would have liked you very much, Margaret." The simplicity of it and the love for his mother that was in it and the generosity of including her in that love moved her in a way that she did not try to diminish. "I think I would have liked her very much," she said. "She raised a good man." He looked at his book and was quiet for a moment, and when he looked up again his eyes were clear and warm. "She would say she just gave him a starting point," he said. "That the rest was his own doing. She was a firm believer in personal responsibility." "She sounds like a sensible woman," Margaret said. "She was," he said. "You remind me of her in certain ways, not in appearance, in the way you move through the world." Margaret thought about this later. The idea of moving through the world in a way that resembled something worthy of lasting love. And she thought about the woman in the orphanage who had first taught her to read, a stern and tired woman who had nevertheless given time to a child who had nothing. And she thought about the long chain of small kindnesses and hard-won competencies that had carried her from that beginning to this fire-lit room, and this man and this life. The world is made of those chains, she thought. Link by link by link, each one connected to the last, and you cannot see the whole of it until you have traveled a considerable distance and looked back. She was still looking back when Isaiah set down his book and said, "What are you thinking about?" "Chains," she said. "That's a peculiar thing to be thinking about by a fire in December," he said. "The good kind," she said, "the kind that hold things together." He considered this with the seriousness he gave to things she said. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I know what you mean." In the spring of 1883, Margaret discovered she was expecting a child. She was certain of it by the end of March, confirmed it by the beginning of April, and told Isaiah on a Tuesday evening after dinner with the straightforward honesty she brought to all important things. He sat very still for a moment. Then he stood and came around the table and took her hands and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, something so purely and completely full that words seemed barely adequate to contain it. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Very well," she said. "Are you happy about it?" "I am so happy about it," she said, and her voice caught slightly on the last word, which surprised them both a little. He held her hands and looked at her, and the kitchen held them as it had held them from the first evening, warm and real and entirely their own. "I'm going to build another room," he said. She laughed. "You have time," she said. "Several months of it." "I want to start now," he said, with the characteristic Shelby directness that she loved entirely. "I want it to be ready well before we need it." He started building the following weekend, with Clem's help and Tomas's occasional contribution, working on the extension to the back of the house with the focused energy of a man who has something specific and important to build toward. Margaret watched from the garden some afternoons, amused by his intensity and moved by the underlying source of it. Hetty Crawford, when informed, hugged Margaret with a warmth that was almost startling from a woman whose default mode was brisk competence. "Oh, that is wonderful news," she said. "Isaiah will be a good father, he has it in him." "I know," Margaret said. "I've seen it with the children I teach on Tuesdays." Hetty pulled back and looked at her. "You'll keep teaching them." "As long as I physically can," Margaret said, "and after when I am able." Hetty shook her head with something that was half exasperation and wholly fond. "You are the most determined woman I have ever met in my life," she said. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." The summer of 1883 was warm and generous, the kind of Kansas summer that produces abundant growth in both fields and gardens. Margaret's vegetable garden was in its second full year under her care, and had become a source of genuine abundance, providing far more than the household needed, and allowing her to put up preserves and dried goods for the winter, with a satisfaction that was deep and particular to someone who had once budgeted every penny and worried about the cost of flour. She was large with the baby by August and had modified her days accordingly, taking the early mornings for outdoor work while the heat was manageable, and spending the afternoons in the shade of the porch, or the cool of the house, continuing to teach the children on Tuesdays and Thursdays, with the adjustment of doing so from a rocking chair that Isaiah had moved into the parlor with absolutely no commentary and absolutely obvious intentionality. Isaiah himself had become, over the course of the summer, rather visibly attentive in a way that he would have firmly denied was excessive if anyone had characterized it as such. He was not hovering exactly. He was present. He happened to be wherever she was with a frequency that might have been coincidental if it had been less consistent. She said to him one evening, "Isaiah, I am not made of glass." "I know that," he said. "You have been watching me cross rooms today as though you expect me to tip over." He had the self-awareness to look briefly caught out. "I have been nearby," he allowed. "You have been extremely nearby," she said pleasantly. "I will endeavor to be somewhat less nearby," he said. "I do not actually require you to be less nearby," she said. "I simply want you to know that I notice and that I find it very dear." The word dear seemed to land on him in a particularly effective way, judging by his expression. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. Their son was born on a Thursday in mid-September of 1883, when the heat had broken and the first suggestion of autumn was in the Kansas air. He arrived in the early morning hours after a labor that Hetty Crawford attended with the efficient calm of a woman who had helped bring more than a few babies into the world. And when he finally made his presence fully known with the remarkable volume that newborns deploy, the sky outside the bedroom windows was beginning to turn the pale gray of pre-dawn. Isaiah, who had been downstairs for the last portion of the labor because Hetty had pointed him firmly in that direction, was brought up when it was over and stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at his wife in the bed with a small and very new person in her arms. And his face did something that Margaret had not seen it do before, that complete and unguarded undoing that comes from a love that is so large it has nowhere contained enough to fit. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time with the practiced care of a man who is very afraid of being careless with something precious. "He is very small," Isaiah said. "He will not always be," she said. "He looks like he has an opinion already," Isaiah said. "He will definitely have opinions," Margaret said. "He comes from two people who have strong ones." Isaiah looked up from the baby to her, and the look was everything, the full and complete sum of every morning of coffee and every evening on the porch and every meal across the kitchen table and every hand held in the prairie dark. "Thank you," he said, and she knew what he was thanking her for. "I believe we did this together," she said. "We did," he agreed. "But you are the one who came here on that stagecoach." "Someone had to," she said. They named him Daniel Thomas Shelby, the Thomas for no particular external reason, but because it felt strong and true, and Daniel because both of them had independently liked it when Isaiah suggested it, and Margaret had agreed with an immediacy that had made him smile. Daniel Thomas Shelby was, from the earliest days, a person of considerable character and significant lung capacity. He slept in the room Isaiah had built off the back of the house, in a cradle that Clem had made during the summer from pine wood that he had sanded smooth with an almost obsessive thoroughness. And he was an entity around whom the entire ranch organized itself in the unself-conscious way of a community that has decided collectively to welcome a child. Esteban resumed his wildflower deliveries, now leaving them not on the kitchen windowsill but beside the cradle on a small shelf, which became a habit he maintained for months. Tomas carved a small horse from a piece of wood and presented it to Isaiah with a gravity that was touching. Clem made weekly inspections of the cradle's structural integrity that were absolutely unnecessary and entirely sincere. Hetty Crawford came weekly and held the baby with the fierce tenderness of a woman whose own children were grown and gone, and who found this an unexpectedly acute pleasure. Clara Dunning sent a book, which was exactly the right thing from Clara Dunning. Margaret healed quickly and returned to the rhythms of the ranch with a determination that was in no way surprising to anyone who knew her, though she adjusted those rhythms around Daniel with the intelligent pragmatism of a woman who was figuring out new territory and doing it well. She held him while she read in the evenings. She set him in a basket in the garden on warm mornings. She fed him and washed him and talked to him constantly with the theory, later borne out by his early and extremely verbal childhood, that babies who are taught to become children who talk. Isaiah held his son every evening when he came in from the ranch work, standing in the kitchen with Daniel on his forearm, speaking to him in the low and unhurried voice he used for things that mattered, telling him about the cattle and the state of the grass and what the weather was doing. Entirely practical conversations addressed to a person who could not yet understand a word, but who watched his father's face with a focused brown-eyed attention that was, everyone agreed, already entirely characteristic. In the years that followed, the Shelby Ranch grew in the way that good things grow, not explosively but steadily, putting down deeper roots and reaching further in the same quiet and persistent way that the prairie grasses spread. Isaiah expanded the cattle operation with careful management, buying up several parcels of adjacent land when they became available at fair prices, none of which he had any reason to fear following the conclusion of Gerald Crane's legal troubles, which had resulted in a fine and a forced departure from Cowley County that had been, by general community consensus, highly satisfactory. Margaret's school had grown from 6 children in the parlor to 12 by the second winter, and by the spring of 1884 had outgrown the parlor entirely. It was Isaiah who suggested, without being asked, that they build a proper schoolroom as a separate structure on the ranch property, and it was Isaiah who drew up the plans and Isaiah who brought the lumber from Caldwell. And when Margaret looked at the finished building with its 4 windows and its proper rows of benches and its small chalkboard on the end wall, she looked at her husband with an expression that was purely and entirely love. "You did not have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "You are a remarkable man," she said, and used his own word back at him deliberately. He smiled the full smile. "I am practical," he said. "Both," she said. Daniel grew in the way that happy children grow, with a confidence in the world that comes from knowing they are genuinely wanted in it. He was walking by the following summer and talking in full sentences by the time he was 2, with the particular verbal intensity of a child who has been talked to constantly and has decided to reciprocate. He followed Isaiah around the ranch with the dedicated focus of a young person who has decided that this is where the most interesting things are happening. And Isaiah responded with a patience and a steady warmth that Margaret watched with a private joy, so full it sometimes felt too large for ordinary days. He was 4 years old and deeply opinionated about horses by the time his sister arrived, in the autumn of 1887. Ruth Isaiah had initially joked should be named after Hetty Crawford, who had delivered every Shelby baby with calm efficiency. But Hetty had expressed a firm preference for not having children named after her, and so they settled on Ruth Eleanor Shelby, the Eleanor for Isaiah's mother, which made something in him very quiet and very glad when they spoke it aloud for the first time. Ruth was different from Daniel in the way that children in the same family are often different, as though the family is exploring different possible human modes. She was quieter than her brother but more observant, dark-haired like her mother, with her father's gray-green eyes, and she watched the world with a steady and thorough attention that made adults feel slightly evaluated. Daniel received the news of a sister with a mix of professional skepticism and eventual enthusiasm that tracked closely with his general approach to new information. He was initially uncertain why a person this small and this loud warranted such significant attention from everyone around her. And then she grabbed his finger on the fourth day and looked up at him with those gray-green eyes, and he was entirely resolved on the matter. "She is looking at me," he told his mother with great seriousness. "She is," Margaret agreed. "She likes me," he said, with a confidence that was purely Shelby. "I expect she does," Margaret said. Hetty Crawford, who had been present as always for the birth, sat in the kitchen afterward with Isaiah and drank the coffee he poured and said, "Your wife is the finest kind of person I've known in 30 years of knowing people." Isaiah looked at his coffee cup and then at the window and then at Hetty and said, "I know. Do you tell her?" "As often as I can find the words," he said. Hetty nodded with the comprehensive approval of a woman who has evaluated a marriage and found it worthy. "Good," she said. The years had a fullness to them that Margaret sometimes thought she could almost see, the way you can see a river from a sufficient height and see the whole of its path, the curves and the wide places and the narrow ones, and understand that it has been going somewhere all along. The ranch was prosperous and well-run and genuinely respected in Cowley County, not only for the quality of the cattle but for the quality of the people on it. Isaiah sat on the board of the Cattlemen's Association and was known as a fair and deliberate voice. Margaret's school was formally recognized by the County Educational Authority in 1886, which resulted in a small but consistent annual funding allotment that allowed her to buy proper textbooks and to pay herself a nominal salary that she put directly back into school supplies. Clara Dunning came out to the ranch school twice a month to assist with the older students and to share the teaching materials, and the two women became the particular kind of friends made between people who respect each other's intelligence, a friendship built on books and arguments, and the pleasure of a mind that pushes back with something worth considering. Clem Purdy worked on the Shelby Ranch until he was 63 years old, at which point his back made the decision for him, and he retired to a small house in Caldwell that Isaiah quietly helped him buy, and came out to the ranch for Sunday dinners with a regularity that made it clear the arrangement was retirement in name only. Tomas and Esteban Navarro remained, and over the years became something more specific than employees, the word being insufficient for what they actually were, which was essential parts of the life of the place, people around whom the daily existence of the ranch was organized, and who organized their own existence around it in return. Esteban, in the spring of 1886, brought home a woman named Lucia, dark and direct and funny, who had come up from the territories to work in Caldwell and had decided, apparently, that Esteban Navarro was a project worth undertaking. Margaret liked her immediately and completely, recognizing in her a version of herself in an earlier time, a woman who had found the specific person and place where she was meant to be and was staking her claim with clear and unsentimental determination. "She is exactly right for him," Margaret told Isaiah. "She is considerably more forceful than him," Isaiah said. "That is exactly what I mean," Margaret said. Esteban and Lucia were married in the summer of 1886 in Caldwell, and the celebration was significant. Margaret danced with Esteban twice and told him that she hoped he knew what he had in Lucia. He said in the serious way he had that he did, and that he hoped she knew what she had in Isaiah. She said she did, absolutely, every day. They stood at the edge of the dance and watched their respective spouses across the room. Isaiah talking cattle with Robert Crawford, and Lucia organizing the dessert table with the focused energy she brought to everything. And the contentment between Margaret and Esteban in that moment was the specific contentment of two people who have arrived in the right lives. The world outside Caldwell and Cowley County was changing through these years, with the restless energy of a nation still figuring out what it was and where it was going. The cattle drives were beginning to change as the railroad extended its reach, the great open ranges being slowly defined and enclosed, the frontier closing like a book being gradually shut. Margaret read about these changes in the Caldwell newspaper and in the magazines that came through the post, and she thought about them with the particular perspective of someone who had arrived in the Wild West at its peak and was watching it become something different. She said to Isaiah one evening in the late autumn of 1888, "Do you miss the older way of it, the open range?" He considered this honestly as he considered everything. "Sometimes," he said, "there was something in that openness, a feeling of possibility that was particular to it. But," she said because she could hear the but in how he had said it, "but possibility is not a substitute for the actual thing," he said. "The possibility of a life is not the same as a life. I have the actual thing." He looked at her across the fire. "We have the actual thing." She looked back at him in the firelight, this man who had opened a door for a woman with a forged letter and a real heart, and had said that the letter did not matter, and she thought that he was exactly right. They had the actual thing. They had built it together from honesty and labor, and the specific kind of love that is not afraid of the full truth of a person. Daniel, at 7 years old, was learning to ride with the serious dedication of a boy who has decided this is among the most important skills a person can possess. He had his father's build and his mother's eyes, and a nature that combined Isaiah's deliberate patience with Margaret's determined precision in a way that was distinctly its own. He could read anything put in front of him, and did so with the appetite of someone who is constitutionally interested in everything. He had already informed his mother that he intended to read every book in the school and then more books after that, and she had told him this was an excellent plan and that she would help him get them. Ruth, at 2, was already showing the analytical patience that would come to define her, studying situations before deciding to engage with them, moving through the world with her father's careful deliberation and her mother's underlying willingness to try things that seemed difficult. On a morning in November of 1888, Margaret stood at the kitchen window looking out at the ranch in the early light. The frost had come, laying a silver edge on everything, the grass and the fence rails and the roof of the barn catching the low sun and throwing it back in cold sparks. The windmill turned in the morning wind. The cattle moved in their slow and patient way in the corrals. Smoke from the hired hand's cabin rose straight in the still air. Isaiah came to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out at the same view. "I need to ride the south fence today," he said. "Some sections looked soft when I was out last week. Take Tomas," she said, "2 pairs of eyes. I will." He bent and pressed his lips to her temple in the brief and specific gesture that was his habitual morning leave-taking, warm and certain and 14 times out of 14 preceded by the word for the day's work, because that was how he was and she loved it entirely. "The children still asleep. Daniel is in the kitchen already," she said. "He's been reading since before light. Ruth, I expect within the hour." He made the sound that was his amused approval of his son's reading habit, a sound that meant something in the neighborhood of what can you do and good for him simultaneously. "He'll want to come with me today. Tell him he can come Friday if the weather holds. He'll negotiate." "Let him negotiate. He needs the practice." Isaiah laughed, the low, warm laugh she had been hearing for 6 years now and which still had the quality of something precious to her. He moved toward the door, lifting his coat from the peg. At the door he stopped and turned back and looked at her the way he looked at her, the full and direct and completely open look. "I love you, Margaret," he said, simple as water. "I love you," she said. He went out into the silver morning, and she heard his boots on the porch steps, and then the sound of the frost-hardened ground under his feet moving toward the barn, and she stood at the window and watched him go. This tall and earnest man who had looked at a forged letter and set it aside and chosen her based on the actual truth of her. And she was so full of gratitude and love and the settled rightness of this life that there was no adequate word for it. Daniel appeared at the kitchen doorway with a book under his arm and his hair uncombed, looking in the morning light very much like his father looked at breakfast, the same calm readiness, the same mild surprise at finding the day already in progress. "Is Papa going to the south fence?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Can I go Friday if the weather holds?" He considered this with a negotiator's appraisal. "What if I finish all my reading assignments today?" "Then you would have finished your reading assignments today," she said pleasantly. He looked at her with the expression that was entirely her own expression looking back at her from his face, the one that said he recognized that he was being given an answer that was technically responsive but structurally immovable. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she confirmed. He went to the table and opened his book, and Margaret went to the stove and began the day's first fire, and the ranch house filled with the warmth and smell of a morning in progress, the coffee beginning to heat, the sound of Ruth stirring upstairs, the distant voices of the ranch hands starting their day outside. This was what she had come for. Not the specific details of it, which she could not have imagined precisely from a boarding house window in St. Louis, but the substance of it, the realness of it, the full and irreducible fact of belonging somewhere and to someone, and to a life that was hers in every room of it, built from nothing but her own hands and her own heart and a stagecoach ride west and a door that had opened. In the spring of 1889, when the air was warm enough to work in the garden without a coat, Margaret knelt in the dirt of the bed she had planted that first year and put in the new seeds for the season and thought about all of it, the whole long chain of it from the beginning to here. Behind her, through the open window of the schoolroom, she could hear Daniel's voice reading aloud to the younger children in a cadence that was already recognizably a teacher's cadence, his mother's son in that too. Ruth sat in the garden with her, patting the dirt with serious small hands in imitation of her mother's planting, her gray-green eyes moving between the seeds in Margaret's face with the comprehensive attention that was entirely her own. "You are planting," Ruth said. "We are planting," Margaret said. "You're helping." Ruth considered this and patted more dirt. "What grows?" "Beans," Margaret said, "and tomatoes, and other things we'll eat all summer." "And feed Papa," Ruth said, with the satisfied logic of a 2-year-old who has identified a clear causal chain. "And feed Papa," Margaret agreed. Isaiah appeared at the garden gate, returning from the south field, taking off his hat and running his hand through his hair in the gesture she knew very well. He looked at his wife kneeling in the spring earth and his daughter beside her with dirt on her hands, and his expression was the one she had first learned to recognize in the 4th week on the ranch, the quiet, full one, the one that meant something larger than what words usually carried. He came and crouched at the edge of the bed and looked at the new-turned earth with its promise of growing things. Ruth immediately held her dirty hands out to him with a pride that expected recognition. He looked at them with great seriousness. "You have been working," he told her. "We are planting," she said, exactly as her mother had said it. "I can see that," he said, and looked at Margaret across the breadth of the garden bed, spring light on his face, sage-colored eyes warm with everything, the whole true sum of these years and everything they had made together. "Good season coming," he said. "The best one yet," she said. She meant the garden. She meant much more than the garden. He reached across the distance of the planting bed and put his hand over hers where it rested in the earth. The same gesture from across the kitchen table in that first autumn, the same warmth, the same completeness. She turned her hand and held his, and Ruth patted both their hands with cheerful impartiality and said something about beans. And the Kansas spring moved around them like a great slow turning, the sky enormous and blue, and entirely without apology above the ranch that had been built by hardship and continued by love, above the schoolroom where a boy was learning to teach, above the garden where a woman who had arrived with a forged letter and a real heart had put down roots so deep that no wind ever made again would lift them, above the man who had held a letter in his hands and set it aside and looked instead at the actual person before him and said, with the characteristic and complete directness of the truest part of himself, that the letter did not matter, that what stood before him was enough, that what stood before him was everything. The windmill turned, the cattle moved in long familiar rhythms, the fence line held, the children grew, the garden produced year after year more than enough. And the Shelby Ranch stood on the Kansas prairie with its whitewashed walls and its two-story certainty and its smoke rising straight into the wide and permanent sky. A home that had been, from a particular Tuesday in the late spring of 1882, exactly what it was supposed to be, and would remain so, as long as any of them drew breath. Margaret Shelby pressed her hands into the spring earth and felt, as she felt every day now, the full and settled weight of a life that was genuinely, entirely, irrevocably hers. She had arrived with a forged letter and a real heart. The cowboy had said the letter did not matter. He had been right. That was all it had ever taken. That and the courage to get on the stagecoach.